In the heart of Onitsha, Nigeria, nestled among bustling markets and dusty roads, stood a church unlike any other, the Temple of Divine Answers. This grand edifice, with its towering spires and gleaming white walls, was renowned across the state for its miracles. But it was governed by a peculiar rule, one that every member obeyed without question. During prayers, all eyes must remain tightly shut. To defy this decree was to invite dire consequences, blindness, madness, or even death. So sacred was this rule that no children, not even infants, were permitted within the church's hallowed walls. The temple was a place for the desperate, for those who had exhausted every doctor, herbalist, or shred of hope. It was whispered that the tighter you closed your eyes, the swifter your miracle would arrive. Testimonies abounded. Blind men regained their sight. Barren women bore twins, triplets, even quadruplets. The lame danced, and, some claimed, the dead were raised. The rule was the key, the faithful believed. Dedication to it was the catalyst for divine intervention. Yet, those who dared to peek during prayers met tragic fates. A tailor who opened his eyes mid-prayer lost his sight the next day. A trader who glanced at the altar during a service collapsed and never rose again. These stories, passed in hushed tones, fueled both fear and faith. The temple's fame spread like wildfire, drawing thousands from across Nigeria and beyond. But in the shadows, whispers grew. Was this power truly from God, or did something darker lurk behind the miracles? Desperation, however, silenced doubt for many. One sweltering afternoon, a woman named Ifeoma staggered toward the temple's iron gates, clutching her lifeless newborn in her arms. Her 10th child, like the 9 before, had been born still. Ifeoma's heart was a wasteland of grief. She had heard of the temple's miracles, how the blind saw, how the barren rejoiced, and believed it held the power to restore her baby. She had run straight from the hospital, her wrapper stained with sweat and tears, her voice hoarse from wailing. "Please, save my child," she cried at the gates, her knees buckling. A crowd of onlookers gathered, their faces a mix of pity and curiosity. But the ushers, clad in starched white uniforms, stood unmoved. "Rules are rules, sister," one usher, a wiry man named Chidi, said coldly, avoiding her tear-streaked face. "No children are allowed. Not even dead ones." Ifeoma collapsed onto the scorching pavement, her cries piercing the air. "He's not just a child. He's dead. Please, have mercy." The gates remained shut. The ushers turned away, their faces carved from stone. Among the crowd stood a young man named Kelechi, a former engineering student who had abandoned university to pursue photography. Kelechi had come to the temple out of curiosity, drawn by rumors of its miracles. He watched the scene unfold, his camera dangling around his neck, his stomach churning. How could a place of healing reject a grieving mother? Something was deeply wrong. As the ushers dispersed the crowd and chased Ifeoma away, Kelechi followed her down the road. He found her slumped under a mango tree, her baby still cradled in her arms, her sobs shaking her frail frame. "I'm sorry for what they did," Kelechi said softly, kneeling beside her. "No one deserves that." Ifeoma's eyes, red and swollen, met his. "I've been coming to this church for 7 years," she whispered. "Every Sunday, every vigil. They promised me a child would live if I followed the rules." "Close your eyes," they said. "Never question." I obeyed. I shut my eyes so tightly my head ached. But my babies, all 10, gone. Her voice broke. "I did everything they asked." Kelechi's jaw tightened. "If this place had God's power, they wouldn't have turned you away. They'd have welcomed you and your child." Ifeoma shook her head, her voice barely audible. "They say it's my faith that's weak. But I've given everything. My money, my time, my hope. What more do they want?" Kelechi's heart burned with anger. He helped Ifeoma to her feet and promised to check on her later. That evening, he returned to his cramped apartment, unable to shake the image of her crumpled form. Rumors about the temple had always swirled, stories of madness, blindness, and mysterious deaths, but Kelechi had dismissed them as gossip. Now, he wasn't so sure. He reached out to a friend, Obinna, a mechanic who had visited the temple once with his fiancée. Over bottles of palm wine, Obinna shared his story. "I almost opened my eyes during prayer, just to see what was happening," he said, his voice low. "Then something brushed my face. Like a cold, clammy hand. My whole body froze. Goosebumps everywhere. My fiancé said it was the Holy Spirit, but that wasn't no Spirit of God. It felt evil, man. Pure evil. I never went back." Obinna leaned closer. "You hear about the pastor's wife, Sister Grace? They say she went mute during a service 3 years ago. Pastor Emmanuel claims she moved to Ghana to start new branches, but nobody's seen her since. I think something happened to her, and he's covering it up." Kelechi's mind raced. He recalled another story, one he'd heard from a neighbor, a woman who ran mad during a temple service. Her family blamed a history of mental illness, but her husband swore she was fine until that day. The pieces were falling into place, and they formed a chilling picture. That night, Kelechi couldn't sleep. His thoughts swirled around Ifeoma, her dead baby, and the temple's iron gates. He made a decision: he would uncover the truth. The temple was holding its monthly deliverance vigil, a massive gathering where thousands bowed their heads in fervent prayer. Kelechi would attend, not to pray, but to see. He slipped into the church, blending with the sea of worshippers. The air was thick with anticipation, the scent of incense heavy. Pastor Emmanuel, a charismatic figure with a booming voice, stood at the altar, his white suit gleaming under the spotlights. "Shut your eyes," he thundered. "Let no one defy the Spirit of God." Kelechi sat in the middle of the congregation, his heart pounding. He wore a small body camera hidden under his jacket, a habit from his days photographing protest. As the prayers began, the pastor's voice echoed through the loudspeakers, calling down fire, healing, and prosperity. The church fell silent, every head bowed, every eye closed. Then, Kelechi opened his eyes. 81st, everything seemed normal, the altar, the choir, the ushers patrolling the aisles. But within seconds, the scene warped. The altar shimmered like a mirage, transforming into a grotesque platform wreathed in shadows. Dark, humanoid figures floated above the congregation, their eyes glowing like embers. Pastor Emmanuel stood at the altar, not praying but bowing to these beings, his hands raised in reverence. The creatures turned their attention to the worshippers, whose eyes remained shut, unaware of the horror unfolding. Kelechi's breath caught as he saw threads of light, faint, shimmering strands, unraveling from the worshippers' bodies, drawn toward the creatures like smoke to a vacuum. A woman to his left, pregnant and swaying in worship, was surrounded by the beings. One reached out with a skeletal arm, piercing her belly as if dipping into water. She didn't flinch, her eyes still closed, her hands lifted in adoration. Terror gripped Kelechi. He wanted to scream, to warn them, but fear sealed his lips. He shut his eyes, praying the nightmare would vanish. But as his lids closed, a wave of dizziness crashed over him. His voice failed, his lips moved, but no sound emerged. The world spun, and he collapsed, unconscious. Hours later, Kelechi woke in his apartment, drenched in sweat. His heart thundered as he bolted upright. Was it a dream? The church, the creatures, the pregnant woman, it felt too vivid to be imagined. He tried to speak, but nothing came out. Panic surged as he rushed to a mirror. His mouth looked normal, but his voice was gone. Stolen. Searching his pockets for his phone, Kelechi found a crumpled paper instead. In faint, unfamiliar handwriting, it read, 14 Mercy Lane. Ask for Gideon. He didn't know any Gideon, but the note felt like a lifeline. He grabbed his keys and drove to the address, arriving at a modest church with peeling paint and a simple sign, House of True Light. Inside, a lone man knelt at the altar, praying softly. He rose as Kelechi approached, his face kind but weathered. "I'm Gideon," he said. "You must be the one sent to me." Kelechi scribbled frantically on a notepad, "My name is Kelechi. I broke the rule at Temple of Divine Answers. Now I can't speak." Gideon's eyes widened. "You're in grave danger, Kelechi. You've brought something back with you from that place. It must be cast out, or in 3 days, you'll be dead." Kelechi's hands trembled. He wished he'd heeded Obina's warnings. Gideon placed a hand on his shoulder. "Fear not. God is greater." He anointed Kelechi's forehead with oil and prayed with a quiet intensity. Heat surged through Kelechi's body, his temperature spiking. After hours of prayer, his voice returned in a hoarse cry, "Jesus." Tears streamed down his face as he thanked Gideon. He recounted the horrors he'd seen at the temple, but questions lingered. How had he gotten home? Who left the note? Then he remembered his body camera. He pulled out the memory card and handed it to Gideon, who plugged it into an old laptop. The footage flickered to life, shaky but clear. When Kelechi opened his eyes in the church, the camera captured everything: the shifting altar, the demonic beings, Pastor Emmanuel bowing to them, the life essence draining from worshippers. Gideon gasped. This is no longer just a warning. This is evidence. As they watched, Kelechi fast-forwarded to the end. His heart stopped. The footage showed Pastor Emmanuel carrying him out of the church, driving him home, and slipping the note into his pocket. Kelechi stared, dumbfounded. Why would the pastor help him? A car pulled up outside. Pastor Emmanuel stepped into the church, his head bowed, his face etched with shame. I've been waiting for a moment like this, he said quietly. A chance to end it. He confessed a harrowing tale. 10 years ago, desperate to grow his struggling church, Emmanuel had been approached by Pastor Obesai, a once humble preacher who had gained sudden fame. Obesai gave him a vial of dark oil, instructing him to pour it into the church's foundation at midnight and enforce the rule of closed eyes. Emmanuel, impatient for miracles, obeyed. The oil unleashed a flood of supernatural power, healings, wealth, crowds, but it came at a cost. The spirits demanded secrecy and sacrifice. Those who opened their eyes suffered. Even Emmanuel's wife, Sister Grace, was struck mute and mad after glancing at the altar. She wasn't in Ghana, she was locked in their home, a shell of herself. I want to destroy the covenant, Emmanuel said, tears falling. But I'm too weak. Gideon, your hands are clean. Help me. Gideon nodded. This battle won't be easy, but God is with us. They drove to the temple, where Gideon knelt at the spot where the oil had been poured. As he prayed, the ground rumbled, lights flickered, and a foul stench filled the air. Dark figures rose, hissing, but Gideon's prayers banished them. Their power shattered. Emmanuel surrendered to the authorities, who shut down the temple. Kelechi's footage aired on national television, sparking outrage and grief. Former members came forward, sharing stories of loss and fear. Sister Grace began to speak again, her sanity restored. The temple, once a beacon of miracles, was now known as the House of Deception. Ifeoma, healed by Gideon's church, found peace and later adopted a child. Kelechi returned to photography, using his lens to expose truth. The nation learned a bitter lesson: not every miracle is divine, and not every pastor is God's servant. Desperation must never cloud discernment. Evil often hides behind holiness, thriving in silence and blind obedience. Keep your eyes open, for the enemy lurks where ignorance dwells.